A long, long time ago, there lived the Whuppie family with Ma, Pa, and their 3 daughters. The 2 oldest girls were very quiet and always did as they were told. The youngest, named Molly, was quite a bit more feisty and scrappy and questioned everything. It drove Ma and Pa crazy. But they were also glad because they knew nobody would push Molly Whuppie around. Nobody. The Whuppie family was very poor and would quite often find themselves without food. One day, while Ma and Pa were out, Molly decided that she and her sisters were old enough to help. Following Molly, the girls went out into the forest to hunt for mushrooms to eat. Molly had gone out with Pa on previous occasions, and she was pretty sure they knew where to go. Maybe? The sun was beginning to set, and Molly quickly realized one thing. They were lost. She decided that they needed to find some place to take cover and hopefully get a few bites to eat. As they continued through the forest, they saw a green light through the trees. "Look," said Molly, pointing. "There's a light." The hungry girls picked up their pace and quickly found themselves looking at a very large castle. "Look how big those doors are. It must be a giant's house," whimpered one of the older sisters. The 3 stood looking at the enormous green light inside, the enormous window that was inside an enormous castle. "Giant or not, we're going in," exclaimed Molly as she led her sisters forward. Molly pounded on the front door. Slowly it opened. Standing there was Mrs. Giant, who looked down upon the very brave Molly and her sisters, who were trembling with fear. Good evening, ma'am. My name is Molly, and these are my sisters. We are in need of food and lodging for the night," she said with as much confidence as she could muster. "Oh," said Mrs. Giant, "I'm not sure that is a good idea. When Mr. Giant gets home, he will see you and surely want to eat you for his pre-dinner snack." Molly thought for a moment and then smartly replied by saying, "Well then, how about we come in and eat quickly? We could be gone before he even gets home." Mrs. Giant was a kindly sort of giant, and behind her were her own 3 daughters, who were tugging at her apron as if to encourage their mama to let the 3 humans in. It had been a long time since they had anyone other than themselves to play with. Knowing how happy it would make her own daughter, she opened the door and invited Molly and her sisters in. The girls were invited to sit by the fire and were quickly given bowls of bread and milk. Their stomachs growled, and they took that bowl and began to eat quickly. "Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the smell of some earthly ones." "Uh-oh." Mrs. Giant quickly stepped in front of him as he eyed the 3 young girls. "Now don't you be a bully, you. They are no different than our 3 girls. Sit down and eat your supper." All Mr. Giant could say was, "Humph." During the supper, the 3 giant sisters begged their mother to allow the 3 human sisters to stay the night. "Please, please, please." Molly's older sister did not understand why Molly was nervous to stay the night. But Molly finally agreed. And as they crawled into the large bed with the giant sisters, Mr. Giant entered the room. Molly looked at him with suspicion and was surprised when he offered the humans a gift. He told them that he wanted them to feel like they were one of the family. And he presented 3 necklaces made out of straw. They looked very similar to the gold necklaces that his own daughters wore. The 2 older girls politely thanked him, while Molly wondered what he was up to. After everyone went to sleep, Molly quickly switched the straw necklaces with the gold ones. As soon as she finished, she heard footsteps coming into the bedroom. Suddenly, she felt a massive pair of hands moving from neck to neck, feeling for the necklaces. She knew it! She knew that double-crossing, good-for-nothing Mr. Giant was pretending to be nice by giving them the straw necklaces. He gave them to them so he could easily identify the humans, take them from the bed, and eat them. Being a quick thinker, Molly pretended like she was starting to wake up, and Mr. Giant quickly snuck out of the room so he wouldn't get caught. She knew he would be back later to gather the humans. So she quickly shook the other 2 awake and quietly explained to them that they needed to follow her. They snuck out of the giant's castle and ran until the sun started to rise. Lo and behold, before their very eyes stood another castle, even larger than the one they had just run away from. It had hundreds of windows and a moat full of water surrounding the entire thing. The girls had never seen anything like this. We've got to get inside, Molly said to herself. The problem was the drawbridge that would get them from one side to the other was up. Molly doesn't give up easily. They walked around to the back side of the castle and came across a single hair rope bridge that only those with a light foot could cross. Who could be lighter than Molly and her sisters? While the girls were crossing, a guard of the castle was watching and waiting. Molly quickly told the guard the tale of the giant. Afterwards, he escorted them to the king. A king! This was a castle of a king! The tale was repeated, and the king quickly informed the girls that this giant had been terrorizing the entire kingdom. It is for this reason the drawbridge was up. Can you believe it, King? Said the guard. Molly outwitted the giant. You are a very clever girl, Molly Whuppie. Very clever. I wonder, the king muttered to himself. What is it that you are wondering, King? Molly asked, as she was a very curious girl. I wonder exactly how smart you really are. Could you, for example, sneak back into the giant's castle and steal his sword? You see, part of his power resides in his sword. The king waited for Molly with a hopeful look upon his face. Molly thought, she would really like to get back at that two-faced, nasty giant, and agreed to the task. Late that afternoon, Molly gathered herself and set off for the giant's castle. She crossed the bridge of one hair and ran as fast as she could to the giant's castle. She snuck in, tiptoed up to the giant's bedroom, and hid under the bed. As soon as she got settled, she heard the loud voice of the giant as he sat down to eat. Immediately after eating, he came into his bedchamber, fell into his bed, and within minutes was asleep and snoring so loudly she was sure he could have been heard from the next kingdom. Ever so quietly, she pulled herself up to the bed, tiptoed towards the ugly giant's head, and walked past his disgusting, putrid, rotting breath towards the headboard where he hung his sword. Oh, so carefully, she lifted the sword off its hook, and she jumped off the bed. As soon as she landed, the sword rattled in its scabbard. The giant woke up, and his eyes met Molly's as she looked over her shoulder. The giant sprang from his bed and lumbered after Molly, who was running as fast as she could. Just as the giant was catching up to her, she reached the bridge of one hair, and she held the sword out in front of her, using it as a balance tool, and quickly made her way across the bridge. She stopped, huffing and puffing, and looked back to where the giant stood with a furious, angry face. Woe worth you, Molly Whuppie. Never you dare to come again. I'm sure we'll meet again, Molly replied with a wink and a laugh. The king stared at the sword in disbelief. This young girl had done in half a day what his prized soldiers had been unable to do in 10 years. As a thank you, he showered Molly and the girls with beautiful jewelry. Molly didn't care, but her sisters sure did. After a short amount of time had passed, the king called Molly back into his chamber. Molly Whuppie, you have proven to be a very smart and brave girl. I wonder, however, if you could manage to do a little more, a little better. Just like the sword, a part of the giant's strength lies within his gold. I wonder if you could steal the giant's purse filled with this gold. The problem is the giant sleeps with the purse under his pillow. You would have to be very, very careful. Molly thought for a moment. Oh, but only for a moment, because she had been bored as of late. She was not the type to lie around just looking at pretty jewels. She needed action. Yes, King, I would like to try my luck. So, that evening, just as the sun began to set, she ran across the bridge of one hair and quickly worked her way to the giant's castle. She stopped for a moment. The giant's castle was unbelievably beautiful. The sun setting reflected this golden hue, and it just looked glorious. How could a nasty, two-faced giant live in such a beautiful castle, she wondered. But she had work to do. So once again, she snuck into the castle, tiptoed into the giant's bedchamber, and waited. After his meal, he fell into the bed and into a deep sleep. When the snoring began, Molly made her move. She got to the giant's head and felt under the pillow and felt until her hand finally found the purse. She gripped hard and pulled and pulled and pulled until the bag came out, and she landed with a crash on the floor, the gold pieces scattering free and making a very loud sound as they hit the floor. Well, you know what happened next, don't you? You're absolutely correct. The giant woke up and saw Molly picking up the gold pieces, and then she took off running with all she had. She made it to the bridge of one hair just as the giant was reaching out to grab her. Whew. Just like before, the giant, waving his colossal fists in the air, screamed, "Woe worth you, Molly Whuppie! Never you dare to come again!" I'm sure we'll meet again. The king sat there, scratching his head. Can this be true? He looked at Molly and shook his head, wondering what to make of this scrappy girl. He truly did not believe that she could do it, and once again she proved him wrong. As a thank you, the king gave part of the giant's gold to Molly and her sisters. Molly didn't really care, but her sisters sure did. Several weeks later, the king called Molly into his chamber one last time. You have certainly proven yourself to be the smartest girl in the kingdom. But I was wondering if you would be willing to prove just how clever you are, asked the king, eyeing Molly to see if he could see any fear in her eyes. I would be willing to give you anything that you ask for, if you would steal the giant's ring, which is where he keeps the rest of his power. Molly had seen this ring and knew that he slept with it on his right pointer finger. So it would be a challenge. A challenge she would take. At sunset, Molly ran to the bridge of one hair, scurried across light as a feather. She ran as fast as she could and suddenly stopped to look at the setting sun that was casting a beautiful red glow. Stunning. At this moment, Molly had the most wonderful thought ever. She quickly followed her previous steps and found herself once again in the giant's bedchamber. He began to snore, and Molly went into action. Just as soon as she placed her hands on the ring, snatch! The giant grabbed Molly between his finger and his thumb and held her out so he could clearly see her face. He stared long and hard at Molly and finally asked her a question. If I had done as much to harm you as you have done to me,
What would you do to me?
Molly thought for a moment and responded by saying, "Well, since you asked, I'll tell you what I would do to you. I would put you into a bag. I would then get a cat and dog and put them inside the bag with you. I would find a needle and thread as well as some shears and put those into the bag too. I would tie the bag up and hang you on a hook. Then I would go into the forest and find the biggest branch that I could find, drag it home, and beat you with it." And that, my friends, is exactly what he did. While the giant was away searching for the biggest stick that he could find, Molly began playing with the cat and dog inside the bag. Oh, she was laughing, the dog was barking, and the cat was meow, meow, meow. Oh, they were having a great time. The giant's wife yelled in from the next room, "What's going on in there?" Molly yelled back, "Oh, nothing here to see." She was laughing louder and louder, and the cat and dog began chasing each other around, barking and meowing. Oh, the commotion. That was it. Mrs. Giant was missing all the fun. She demanded that Molly tell her exactly what was happening inside that bag. So, Molly decided to show her instead. She took the shears out and cut a hole into the bag. She jumped out and stepped aside, and she invited Mrs. Giant to jump in. As soon as she was inside, Molly quickly sewed up that hole. Of course, she took the needle and thread with her. Molly grabbed the ring that the giant had miraculously left on the table and hid behind a chair next to the bag. Giant came in, grabbed the bag off the hook, placed it on the ground, and walked to the front door where he had left the branch. More like a tree. This was Molly's opportunity to scurry out the side door. By the time the giant returned to the sack, there was so much hooting and hollering going on from the dog, from the cat, and from his wife. Was that his wife's scream? He opened the bag and his suspicions were confirmed. Molly had tricked the wife into going inside the bag. Meanwhile, Molly had run as fast as she could to the bridge of One Hair. She paused, looking over her shoulder just as the giant made it to the bridge. And then she heard the giant scream his loudest and scariest scream. "Woe worth you, Molly Whuppie! Never you dare to come again." "We will never meet again." She took the ring to the king, who asked Molly what it is she wanted in return. Well, do you remember that wonderful thought she had right before entering the giant's castle one last time? Now that the giant had lost all of his power, Molly knew he would have to leave the kingdom, which meant that his castle was empty. Molly and her sisters, along with Mom and Dad, moved into the castle, where they lived joyfully for the rest of their lives. One last note. Molly kept the giant-sized doors as a reminder to always stay feisty.